Welcome to Nada Yada Island.
We're back on the Nada Yada Island Confessions Show. Benny is about to tell us how he found two loves. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks to Metro, I found iPhone 12 and Apple Watch SE.
At Metro, get the perfect match of both iPhone 12 with 5G and Apple Watch SE for only $99.99. You heard that right. Both for just $99.99. Holidays with Nada Yada Yada. Only at Metro by T-Mobile.
Bring your number and ID, sign up for Metro Flex Plus, and add a watch line. Not available if you're with T-Mobile or been with Metro in the past 180 days. Limit 2 per account.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Outward, Slate's podcast for the LGBTQs and you. I'm Bryan Lowder, an editor at Slate, and I'm really excited about this week's show because we're finally going to get a chance to talk about a book that I've been wanting to cover since it came out earlier this year. It's called Swole, The Making of Men and the Meaning of Muscle by Michael Andor Brodeur. Now, in case some of those words make you a little itchy, know that Michael is gay and a very talented critic, so this is definitely not some unexamined Jim Bro circle jerk. Instead, it is a kaleidoscopic mix of memoir, history, criticism, and political commentary with writing that is just bursting at the seams with intelligence, warmth, and humor. And it all circles around this question of why so many men, including the author, want to be big. And it also explores what that desire can teach us about the evolution of masculinity over time, as well as the crisis that it seems to be experiencing today. And though this timing was not really planned, masculinity's crisis is a subject with renewed relevance after the recent presidential election, where it's now clear that manosphere influencers and male grievance around something like wokeism and men's place in society may have had a lot to do with getting Donald Trump back into the White House. So whether you even lift bro, this is a conversation you won't want to miss. We will be back with Michael after a short break.
Streaming December 12th on Peacock. Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie are back.
That's hot. Loves it.
For a show-stopping reunion that will prove putting on an opera is anything but simple.
We're really good at this.
One thing's for sure, they won't be upstaged.
Good to have you back. Come on, we've got a show to do.
Paris and Nicole, The Encore, a 3-part reunion special, streaming December 12th, only on Peacock.
How about listening to the sounds of Istanbul? Beautiful, isn't it? But you can't discover the coolest city in the world just by listening. Check Istanbul.goturkiye.com now and plan your Istanbul trip today.
Feel your max with Brooks Running and the all-new Ghost Max 2. They're the shoes you deserve, designed to streamline your stride and help protect your body. Treat yourself to feel-good landings on an ultra-high stack of super comfy nitrogen-infused cushion that takes the edge off every step, every day. The Brooks Ghost Max 2. You know, technically, they're a form of self-care. Brooks, let's run there. Head to brooksrunning.com to learn more.
All right, we are back. Our guest today is Michael Andor Brodeur. Michael has been the classical music critic at the Washington Post since 2020, and for a decade before that, he served as an assistant arts editor and cultural critic for the Boston Globe. His essays, humor, and criticism have appeared in Nylon, Thrillist, Entrepreneur, Medium, McSweeney's Internet Tendency, and other publications. He has also released 5 music albums under different monikers, most recently writing and performing electronic music under the name New Dad. Welcome to Outward, Michael. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Gosh, I wish we could have a whole other show about your electronic music. I want to know about that. But today we are here to talk about your book. So as a way of getting started, in the introduction, you talk about a coming out that you've had, though it's not about your sexuality, but it does have to do with your body. And I want to read a quick passage because I think it's a really great one. You write, "As best I can tell, every time I go to the gym, I am trying in a very literal way to become more myself. Put another way, I want to be a big man. And holy shit, that felt just as gross to type as it did to think, if not more. And I'm pretty sure that one day I'll have to speak that line aloud, perhaps today. And that, my friends, is going to suck. Be there, but it's the truth, and it's important just to say it, type it, acknowledge it. You say that this desire to be big is gross. I would like for you to unpack that for us, and maybe at the same time, just sort of share with listeners what motivated you to write this book, because I think these things kind of overlap a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. It was sort of a combination of things. I got into this pretty horrible bike accident not long ago. And while I had always dabbled in the gym before, I was never really serious about my pursuit in there. But when I was doing my rehab to recover from this bike accident where I had broken an arm and both wrists, and I was using the gym quite a bit. And when I got back to normal, it just occurred to me to kind of keep going. And so I started in a powerlifting clinic, and what was supposed to be a 10-week cycle turned into like 3 or 4 years of just strict powerlifting. And being a critic, I just, I tend to self-question a lot.
Sure.
To doubt myself and to dig into the motivations for why I enjoy the things that I enjoy. And I found that most of the reference points that I had when I was lifting were actually like literary. They all had to do with like literary themes like pointlessness, repetition, strength, weakness.
Right.
All of these things that had tethers back to mythology and to all the literature that I liked. And this discovery kind of uncovered the fact that, I felt a little bit of shame about this pursuit. I was keeping it very much to myself, and I wanted to get to the bottom of that. Where is this? Why did the pursuit of a big, muscular presenting body feel like a betrayal of something that I had constructed with my identity throughout my life? And I couldn't tell if that was because, was I becoming the body that pushed my former body into a locker?
Right. Sure.
Was I taking the form of the oppressor, as it were?
Yeah.
So I started to become fascinated with both of these things. One, this long-standing idea that I had this almost instinctual desire to do this with my body, to be bigger than I was, to be like the passage says, literally more myself. But then also the black hole of feelings that come with that, both from my perspective as a gay man. Muscle was a path to visibility,
right,
in certain scenes, and then there's also a path to safety in certain scenes. I talk about it in the book that there's a little bit of a feedback loop that happens if you're a gay man pursuing a big body, because you're trying to attract, but you're also trying to repel. You're trying to be desirable, but you're also trying to become the thing you desire. There's so many complications, and I wanted this to be a book just for men in general, and smuggling my gay life into that is a strategy to disarm any reader to the kind of universal themes that I think men come upon in the gym.
Yeah. Well, speaking of men in general, another thing that you sort of set up in the introduction is that you say you're worried about men. And so I wonder, we're going to talk, I think, more about the manosphere and all of that a little later in our conversation in detail. But just up front here, what do you mean by being worried about men?
A lot of times when we talk about what inspired this book, there's a very simple question that underlines the whole thing that I hear constantly, especially online, and that's, are men okay? There's so many ways in which men are lashing out in the spirit of manhood, right? Like where it's not just like they're angry at this or that. They're angry at it in terms of them being a man and being angry about it, or the things that they're observing in culture being some sort of violation of manhood. And it's like this giant group project where no one's doing the work. The worry comes from, I consider myself old. I'm older than I ever thought I'd get as a gay man. I'm 48.
Sure. Yeah.
And I'm so happy to have had 18 pre-internet years to experience the world the way I did before the internet. I can't speak for young men who have come up online, who have had to forge their identities in a world that is almost completely based on image and text and distortion and a sort of flattening of the self into a product that someone else might like to click on. I can't imagine the burden of that, frankly. And I try to have a lot of compassion when I think about the younger generations and just the onslaught of images and expectations that they face compared to the relatively small piddling of body image pressures that I had, many of them self-imposed. So the absorption of these images and the weight of the pressures they put upon you, I think are something that I can't really imagine. But what I can do is look at the history of these images and the history of these pressures and try to form them into a narrative that makes the chaos of the present moment make a little bit more sense to young men. And so I hope that's what I'm doing with that. But that's where my worry comes from. It's a weird paternalistic thing. I want young men to be healthy and happy. I want them to be interesting, and I want them to be people with depth and character and friends and real relationships. And these are all things that I see, just statistically disappearing among younger men. And that is, considering the type of political environment that we're going into, that is shabby shape to have generations of young men in. They can be mobilized against pretty much anything. Yeah. So a lot of the book is about self-worth and discovering where your self-worth comes. It's not a self-help book, but it is about the presence of that worth within and without the body.
So before we get any further into sort of the nitty-gritty of the book, I do always like to give our listeners a little bit of an overview of how the book is laid out. Swole has a really interesting form, I thought. It's 12 chapters that are divided into two sort of big subsections each. You call it 12 sets of 2 reps, which I thought was funny. And it's also modeled somewhat on the 12 trials of one of your primary figures, Hercules. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you came to this format and what you thought it allowed you to do, and also maybe a little bit about Hercules. Why is he looming so large?
I thought it was important for a book like this not to be scoldy. Men can be very touchy when being addressed about their masculinity.
Right, of course.
And so I thought that a good way to tell this story, to ask these questions, was just to reveal that I had wrestled with them myself and asked them myself. And the way to do that was a memoir, kind of focused on the body. So one half of the book, 50% of the book, is this twig to big story that I'm trying to tell. And then the other 50% is where I sort of get into the cultural. That's where I sort of put on my critic hat. Right. And I kind of wrestle with, like, what are the cultural implications of this, the societal implications of this, what are the literary and cultural antecedents of these things? And that can go anywhere from, like, Greek mythology to, Walt Whitman, writing a fitness column under a pen name.
Yes. I'm going to ask about that in a minute. So let's don't spoil
sure.
it.
Yeah. That can go into, like, beefcake magazines and porn. And I mean, there's so many different ways that these concerns have bubbled up through history. So I wanted to tell both those stories. And I realized that my story, the memoir, was a microcosm of the larger history. And I couldn't imagine that I was alone in that. There's a privacy that I'm trying to establish between me and the reader. I think men like those sort of environments of confidence.
Yeah,
where they can trust each other. The gym is one of those.
Indeed, yeah.
But formally, all of my writing training, if you can call it that, like both my degrees were in poetry. I didn't go to school for journalism. So form has always been something that I've been really interested in. I mean, there's a whole chapter on form in the book. And so, there's several forms going on at once. There's this reference to the 12 trials of Hercules. Each of the 12 chapters is divided in 2. And the way I thought of those was almost like, because they're different ways of thinking, I thought of them almost as the eccentric and the concentric halves of a rep, like the push and the pull.
The push and the pull, right.
That's where form comes from. On Hercules, I think this is another question of form, but on sort of a different scale. Our mythological heroes provide forms, archetypes for us to sort of fit into. And Hercules, to me, is so interesting because he really represents the kind of crisis of masculinity that we're at today. In that, if you look at most of the things that made Hercules a hero, most of the occasions that he had to prove his value and his worth were him making up for mistakes that he had made. Right? He would go into a place and just fuck everything up, and then as penance, perform these heroic feats. And so we remember his heroic feats, but we forget that it's all penance. It's all making up for this thing that he did, these wrongs that he did. And I just think that's a very interesting way to look at heroism. Meanwhile, you have other heroes like Sisyphus, and I do a lot of thinking about him through the lens of Camus. Not only is he a man pushing a rock up a hill pointlessly, and certainly I identified with that at many points in my gym journey. But it's also a question of where you find your worth. And Camus suggests that the moment that he finds his worth, his real humanity, is when the rock rolls back down and he makes the decision to turn around and follow it back and do it again. all of these things signal something about what it is to be a man as it's told to us or as it's felt within us. And I didn't want to beat people over the head with mythology, but I do think it shadows the way that we interpret things, even in our sort of hyperactive internet culture today.
Yeah, absolutely. A minute ago, you mentioned Walt Whitman, and I did want to talk about that this is a magazine column that I think you named it, Manly Health and Training.
Yeah, it was for the New York Atlas.
Yeah, and so he writes this under a pseudonym, which I'd love for you to explain that because it's very funny. And it interestingly sort of contains, in a way, like some of the origins of the like manosphere discourse we here today. So could you tell us a little bit about what Whitman was up to in Manly Health and Training?
Yeah, so Manly Health and Training was a series of articles that Walt Whitman wrote for the New York Atlas in the mid-1800s, and he did it under a pseudonym, Mose, M-O-S-E, Velzer, E-L-S-O-R. Now, Velzer was his mother's maiden name, so that has an obvious anchor there. Mose is a little bit more tricky. Mose was a name that was sort of a reference to Mose Humphreys, which was kind of a folkloric figure that was attached to the Bowery Boys in New York. These being sort of working class, roughneck guys that kind of formed this kind of, loose gang. It wasn't necessarily like a criminal gang, but they were just sort of the tough guys. And Mose, who is believed to have actually existed, was sort of this folkloric figure modeled off of this more general type of dude that was in the Bowery at that point. So, and the types of things that Mose could do, he could like pick up a train and throw it. Or so he was sort of like an urban downtown Paul Bunyan.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking
right?
too. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and so the urban legends about Mose and his antics and his strength and all of this stuff, that eventually turned into a stage show and all this stuff, right? Walt Whitman adopting this name as a first name for his pseudonym was sort of a way of just like putting some dirt on his face and like making it's, if you saw that Mose was writing it, there's a man writing this right? A little less so than if it's like this up and coming poet, Walt Whitman, who, celebrates nature and the body electric and all that. I love to think about what Walt Whitman was up to with that strategy. Then again, he also had a bad habit of writing under pseudonyms to review his own books and to talk about how great they were. But the column itself really dug into manhood as more of a way of life, a set of activities, a set of responsibilities to your own body that you had. It was about taking cold, like you said, it sort of was prescient of the manosphere, and that it was like all about like touching grass, as the kids say now. Getting out there, taking cold baths. It encouraged, abstaining from alcohol, abstaining from sex, but living this very physical, virtuous, active outdoor life that put you fully in touch with the beauties of nature and all that stuff. Now, it did this in a very, we were comparing it to the manosphere, but this was done in a far less toxic way.
Yeah,
it wasn't saying if you don't do this, you're not a man, but it was sort of like, it was observing this creeping sedentary property that was overcoming American men after the Industrial Revolution, when a lot of the jobs moved into cities, moved into offices, moved into factories, and moved away from like real manly work or whatever, swinging a hammer or whatever. Right. So everywhere there was talk about, the withering specimen of the American man when compared to his European counterparts. And you can see where that's going. So while Walt wasn't the only one talking about this sort of thing, there were all sorts of primordial man influencers forming at that point. I would say he was the one talking about it with the most tenderness and with the most genuine ardor for men in general. Like, read his poetry and you can tell that this is a man who values everything about men, their friendship, their beauty, their strength, all that stuff. And when you read Manly Health and Training, if you know it's Walt, you know it's Walt. If you don't know it's Walt, then you're like, oh, this guy's quite a writer for a fitness guy. But everywhere in the text of this is this celebration of his fellow man as like the building blocks of a strong democracy. And you really get the sense that he just wants the best for all of his readers.
Yeah.
It must have killed him to cheat himself that byline. because I know how much.
Yeah.
Because you could tell he dumped a lot into it. But as a gay man now who grew up seeing Walt Whitman as this sort of inexplicit tether to my future self, it's very interesting to see him grappling with these same ideas of where masculinity sits in the body. Because certainly his life was an example of a kind of multiplicity of ways to handle and present that idea.
I think that is an excellent place to take a short break. We will be right back after that with more from Michael.
So, you want to be a marketer. It's easy. You just have to score a ton of leads and figure out a way to turn them all into customers. Plus, manage a dozen channels, write 1 million blogs, and launch 100 campaigns all at once. When that's done, simply make your socials go viral and bring in record profits. No sweat. Okay, fine. It's a lot of sweat. But with HubSpot's AI-powered marketing tools, launching benchmark-breaking campaigns is easier than ever. Get started at HubSpot.com/marketers.
Come to me.
Focus Features invites you to succumb to the darkness.
Nosferatu.
From director Robert Eggers comes a masterpiece of horror.
He is coming. This creature is a force more powerful than evil. It is death itself.
Nosferatu. Rated R. Under 17nm without parent. Only in theaters Christmas Day. Special engagements in Dolby and IMAX.
All right, we are back. Michael, one idea that you track across the book that I'm kind of obsessed with the more I think about it is this notion of men being bullied into their bodies, meaning that bullying, whether by actual bullies in some cases or something awful like the presidential fitness test, which you write about and gave me chills from memory, pushes many men, including yourself, I think, into wanting to be big. This is also connected in the book to the idea, and this is something I really resonated with, that gay boys in particular are made to be or sort of make themselves into beings of pure thought as a way to disappear, into the background or to sort of evade homophobia, or maybe even to feel superior to other people. That's something I think I did. And, I do have friends, I think, who have gotten into lifting precisely because they wanted to reclaim embodiment. The gay friends, to reclaim their embodiment. So I wondered if you could just talk about that dynamic, because I think it's really insightful and fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that applies to how I embrace this journey. I think I really started thinking about it, though, when I started researching the book and started just looking at all of my favorite kind of action stars, bodybuilders, wrestlers, all of these things. I can't even tell you how many ghost-written wrestler biographies I have on my bookshelf right now. So anyway, I was reading a lot about all of these, like, both senses kind of Titanic figures in my youth. And I can't think of any of them that didn't have a childhood that wasn't characterized in narrative by bullying, by whether it was cruelty from their dads, whether it was cruelty from their fellow students. It was always a man somewhere or a boy pushing them away and pushing them into the gym. Lou Ferrigno, bullied for his deafness, bullied for how small he was. Arnold Schwarzenegger, picked on by his dad. Any wrestler, they all have the story about how they were kind of picked on, pushed, and how the body became a form of resistance to that. Just a way to present yourself in a way that shows that you shouldn't pick on me. So whenever I see big dudes right now, knowing this, I feel a softness towards them. I know something brought them there. I wasn't like heavily bullied, but I was aware of myself as a target, right? I knew it. So I had a couple strategies. One of them was making nice with the heavies. The other technique that I had was what you mentioned, sort of becoming a being of pure thought. I wanted to just be my thoughts and not be my body because my body was so inconsequential. And so I was like a star student. I'm living the same life today. I will tell you, it's not because of my extreme aptitude or dedication to, or my time management skills. None of that. It was an escape. It was a way for me to find a way that I could remove myself from that danger. It wasn't going to happen in gym class. It wasn't going to happen in sports. But if I was getting straight A's all the time, those things would go unnoticed. And, that's one story out of millions of little gay boy stories about how to navigate this gauntlet of, being in a body that's going to be picked on for what it contains.
Yeah, and then, like I say, reclaiming that potentially later through lifting. You do write in the book about the recent right-wing war on drag that we've seen over the last couple of years and definitely talked about on this show. And you write a bit about why men might be upset or sort of disturbed by drag queens. But then you do this interesting pivot and you explore how muscle itself is a kind of drag. And this really struck me because I've thought of boy drag as something for a long time, just like putting on male clothes. But I never thought about like muscle itself as a kind of drag. And you have this great passage about that I'd like to just read quickly. You say, after all, what are big muscles but drag? Decades spent being not quite one of the boys drove me to consciously overcompensate by growing muscles like massive protective pads. When I started building my body, I wanted to take everything about myself that I'd once struggled to hide, my wafy arms, my weak back, my absent ass, and make them impossible to miss. I wanted to build a new me atop the old one. I wanted to poof it with beef, contour its curves. I wanted to present anew, be noticed upon entrance, project beauty and power and confidence just by showing up differently, making more of what made me less. I wanted my body to be commitment to the bit. I wanted to become a real man by becoming an unreal one, a form in submission to a fantasy. I have to tell you that this actually helped me clarify something about my gender identity, which is that, technically I'm a cis man. That's definitely true. But reading you talk about drag and muscle this way, I think I'm really something that I might call more of like the faggot, which I think it has to do with being sort of uninterested in masculinity in certain ways, even though I'm like embodied that way. And I think this in turn explains why when I've dabbled in lifting myself, I've always felt like I was doing a kind of bad drag and never really stuck with it for this reason, because I felt like a Halloween queen on the stage with real drag queens, right? Like that kind of thing. So anyway, some personal insight to what the book did for me, but I'm curious to hear you talk about this idea of muscle as drag and sort of how you thought about that.
Yeah. And, I think I love the drag metaphor. I think one risk of it is that it suggests to people that might not be familiar with how personal drag is for people that do it, that it's somehow, I'm suggesting it's a costume or a put on.
Sure.
Or a persona. Far from it. I think that as with drag, it's a way to take something that's already there and make it bigger and more visible.
Yeah.
And almost like cartoonishly unavoidable. I know a lot of drag performers that take the thing that they hate most about themselves and they sort of inflate it.
Yeah, sure.
And make it a source of power. And I don't want it to be taken too literally, but when I started looking at what men were really doing in the gym and what they were getting out of it, and everything from just the clothing that you had to wear to go there, the techniques and skill that you had to learn, kind of performance that you have to do while you're there, the tropes, the heroes, the legends, the children. It's a whole world that you submerge yourself into. And then the act itself, the private act itself, the looking into the mirror, the charting, the change, the transformation of one thing into the other while staying generally the same person. There's a lot of guys that have a different name in the gym. They get called something else. It becomes this way to sort of like separate yourself from yourself, both in terms of the culture that surrounds it and the act itself. And what are we doing other than taking something that's loosely related to our gender and inflating it, amplifying it, enhancing it? There is a comic element to big muscles. There is a novelty to it. We wouldn't have these Planet Fitness characters if that wasn't the case. There's a freak show element to it that relates it to drag. This idea that you're taking, if you would look at gym culture in the 80s and 90s, it was far less mainstream. It was way more about this freak mode type of thing.
Yeah.
And that persona of the misunderstood freak and stuff, that is something that perpetuates in muscle and drag. I think, when I compare it to drag, I think more generally, I'm suggesting that specifically the big muscle body as an expression, as a way to show up in the world, to me, strikes me as just another way of moving freely about the cabin of one's gender. And I don't think that it's seen that way by the men doing it. They just see themselves as becoming more man.
Right.
And I think for people that have been on the losing end of these gender struggles on the cultural level, I think it's hard for us to imagine that one would want to move further in that direction. And yet, it is just the same. It is mere motion on the spectrum. It is motion on the spectrum. And, that's why I kind of have this agnostic view of steroids. When I think about steroids, I kind of see it as I'm not saying everyone do steroids. I'm not advocating for them. But when I see men using them, I have a hard time not seeing that as a variant of gender-affirming care. Where they are, because when I talk to men, and I talk to a lot of men that have used steroids, provided they're not abusing it, and, the book has a cautionary tale about that as well.
Yes.
But when they're used for what they are intended to do, the end result is that these men feel more at home in their bodies. And what am I to say to that?
Yeah.
How can I see that differently? And were I to remove the stigmas of femininity, the stigmas of masculinity, the stigmas of androgyny in between these gray areas, the stigma of non-binary presentation where you just refuse to commit, like all the stigmas that attend whatever gender we settle on. If I remove all of those, all of us are just looking for a parking space on this thing. And I can certainly fault someone's abuse of steroids. I can fault them for pressuring others to do steroids. I can fault the motivations one might take to doing that. Is it strictly to do this, strictly to do that? They're dangerous. They're unregulated. There's all sorts of problems.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, if I look at what's going on there, to me, it's a form of agency. And I have more so after writing this book than before. I have a hard time coming up with a singular judgment on men that take those measures.
Yeah. Before we go, I definitely wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the aggrieved men and manosphere that, as we know now, were a major influence on our presidential election. Sure. It seems like the Jordan Petersons and whatnot really did have an impact, and that men's sense of, dislocation or isolation in society mattered, seriously to getting Trump back into the White House. I'd like to hear you talk about that, but I'd especially like to hear you do that through this lens that I think is really helpful that you set up about masculinity, maybe not being toxic, but broken, and how changing that word sort of changes what's going on.
Sure. Toxic masculinity has become a big buzz phrase over the past 10 years as the internet has sort of fleshed out a very particular type of behavior. We can go back to like Gamergate, all that stuff, and see the beginnings of these things happening. The problem with the term toxic masculinity is that I think men thinks it sounds cool. So like, if you're going to tell men that something's toxic, they're going to be like, yeah, right. And already you can see it like in people's Instagram bios. It's like, stay toxic, or like, I'm just being toxic over here. There's merch, I think you run less risk of that co-opting happening when you go with a phrase like broken masculinity, where we're talking about something that's still there. It's just not working the way it's supposed to. And in its dysfunction, it's hurting those who participate in it. This also preserves masculinity from being just tainted, just seeming like, in and of itself bad.
Right.
Or that the whole thing could spoil like meat in the fridge or something like that. I don't think that's the case. I think broken implies it can be fixed.
Yeah.
So that's what I like about that. When we look at what's happening to men today, I think and the fact that you pointed out that the Rogans, the Petersons, all that stuff had an impact. How did they have an impact? The internet plays a big part in what's happening to men right now. And there's two reasons for that. One of them is that we underestimate the strength of the parasocial relationship. For men who are isolated, lonely, looking for connection, looking for definition, in a way that men of my generation just didn't occur to us to do that. If you were like a dating coach when I was growing up, you would have got your ass handed to you. Like, who are you? Why are you running this conference at the Holiday Inn? Get out of here. Like, there was not a place for men telling each other how to date. It still strikes me as weird. I'm sure that's like some weird hang up of mine, but like, I see this culture of men telling each other how to be men, and it just blows my mind because we had nothing to compare it to. I mean, I guess the closest thing would be like Tom Cruise's character in Magnolia. This would be 1999, and he was sort of like, respect the cock. And he was doing these sort of hotel function room presentations, but it was like the whole framing was that it was a pathetic at root. So we've come a long way since then. We've lost all that shame, and now the making of men has become an industry all its own. And that's sort of like what I'm referring to in the title is this. It's become like a process of a manufacturing process. The other part of this, beyond the parasocial thing, is that if men in America had defined their worth in the past by their work, by their presence, by their physical presence, by their physical authority you know, whether that be showing up at a bar or showing up on the football field or showing up at the office or whatever. The internet has taken that physical turf away and has replaced it with this virtual badlands. And men have been left, just like everyone else, to reconstruct their identities out of images, text, sentiments, attitudes, comments, replies, all that sort of thing, with all the regular rules intact in terms of emotional restriction and all that stuff, right? So when you have that anger, that aggression, and now it has to be channeled into language and image, all of a sudden we have a toxic strata of the entire media ecosystem. When I say media ecosystem, I'm not talking about what's on TV. I'm talking about the way that we just interact through this. But there's a whole strata of that is this rock hard layer of male identity and what form it takes right now. And it's really bad. It's really bad because it's desocializing these men. So when I think about the manosphere, I'm thinking about a group of people that are that have a financial advantage in keeping these men losing.
Yeah.
Giving them the advice that will only lead them back for more advice. That will only reaffirm their worst impressions of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It's not positive. It doesn't lift these men up. It funnels them into a cycle of grievance from which they have a very hard time escaping and a very hard time relating to those who have found their way out. So like a trans person to one of these men who has achieved a type of freedom that they can't even understand.
Yeah, sure.
Becomes a primary target because they're not free. They're violating the rules that have been keeping me in. You know? So, you know, the depersonalization of the internet paired with the intense parasocial commitments that men have made with the internet, it's a really hard set of knots to untangle. And so, you know, I think with the book, I'm just trying to like show just how tangled together these things are on on the basis of individual men. Yeah.
Yeah. But as you say, you know, maybe it's just broken and that implies we can fix it. So that's something to think about as we go forward from this election.
A little bit of hope, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That is all the time we have for this week. We could have talked about so much more, listeners. I really want you all to seek out this book. It's called Swole, The Making of Men and the Meaning of Muscle. It's by Michael Andor Brodeur. You can get it anywhere books are sold. It's been out for a little while now. And I think it would probably make a great Christmas gift for the meatheads in your life or other people too. So definitely go check that out. Michael, where can people otherwise find your work and follow you?
Well, I'm the classical music critic at the Washington Post. So I show up there several times a week. You can find me there. As for the book, I would say buy it before it's banned.
Yes. Good point.
Wish I was joking, y'all. Wish I was joking.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, you know, between the post and the book, that's mainly what I'm working on right now. I might get back to music, but we're moving into a new house, so I have a whole studio to set up before I even talk about that.
Again, thank you, Michael, so much for being on the show today. This was a fantastic conversation, and it's a really wonderful book.
I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, that is it for the main show today, but there's always more Outward over in the Slate Plus feed. This week, Michael Brodeur will stick around to help us update the gay agenda. If you're not already a subscriber, remember that by joining Slate Plus, you'll get ad-free podcasts, extra segments on all of our shows, and you'll never hit a paywall on the Slate site. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts by clicking Try Free at the top of the Outward show page, or visit slate.com/outwardplus to get access wherever you listen. Please send feedback and topic ideas, as always, to outwardpodcast@slate.com. Our show is produced by noted queen of the gym, Pallet Shaw. If you like Outward, please subscribe in our podcast app, tell your friends about it, rate and review the show so others can find it. That's all for now. Until next time, I guess, go lift and stay gay and stay swole, everybody.